Say something. It's like a podcast, but it's a vodcast, so you can listen and watch. It's like news talk or sports talk, but it's life talk, so we can walk the road together. On today's episode, Rebecca White, food blogger and contributor for the Dallas Morning News, chats with us about Thanksgiving inheritance and food soul as well as physical nutrition. Thanks for joining the conversation. Here we go. That we wanted to kind of chat about really was food and memories, okay?
Okay.
And beyond nutrition, food's soulful impact just on our memories and making memories. And so I know that you've thought about that for a while, and especially with holidays coming and the stress that people feel like they have, you know, because there's something about it. I don't know. Is it about family or?
There's that expectation to have the perfect
Who did
Thanksgiving. I don't know.
Was it Pinterest?
Maybe.
Was it Martha Stewart?
I think it was before any of those. I think it goes back generations.
Do you really?
I do.
Okay.
But I think there's a strive to have that perfected Thanksgiving, but it's also, there's a swing back to where it's not just that it has to look right, but that it has to feel right, and that it has to be emotionally connected, I think, at this point. And, you know, for my family, there was always this rallying recipe that we always got behind, and that was called Thanksgiving noodles. And
Thanksgiving noodles.
Yes. So it's
Why noodles?
Well, that's the giant question mark that we're all wondering. Why was our particular family in Oklahoma, why did we end up using this recipe on Thanksgiving and Christmas? We don't know. We kind of think that it came back from the 1800s, the Cherokee Strip. My family ran this land run in the 1800s.
Okay, so your parents were your great-great-grandparents or? Great-great-grandparents. So they were in the land rush.
They were in the land run, yes.
Okay.
And they claimed territory. They named a city after their last name, Carrier. And but they had nothing. They really had nothing at that point, and they lived a life and they built something for their family and for the generations to come. And so we believe that this recipe came from that minimal lifestyle, because it's eggs, flour, baking soda, water, and you just mix it all together, and then you roll it out and you cut it, and then you boil it with chicken stock from an old hen. That's what my grandma would always say, because they were using those leftover chickens that they had. So it was using everything that they had. And our family decided to cook that during Thanksgiving. And we would, a couple weeks before Thanksgiving, go to my grandma's house, and my aunt, all my cousins, and we would watch my grandmother stir the dough, make the dough, and then just roll it out. And my mom and my aunt would help, but it was my grandmother who had ownership over
the noodles.
Oh, she's the sweetest lady you would ever meet, and she would never said a critical word, but if you tried to make those noodles, she would come and she would investigate, and she was like, that's not thin enough, and then she would go out and she would just roll the dough.
So that was definitely before the pasta attachment on your KitchenAid.
Yes, it was. You roll it out, then you roll it into a cylinder-like shape, and then with your knife, you cut it into little rolls. But it was one of those legacies that I love, because my grandmother, she wasn't a cook. She loved to bake. She didn't like to cook. My mother didn't like to cook. My great-grandmother, stories where she didn't like to cook either, but it was my great-grandmother, Grandmother Shepherd, who loved to cook. And my grandmother would tell me how Grandmother Shepherd could make anything delicious. And so I caught that gene a couple of generations later, and I'm the 5th generation to make these noodles. And 2 years ago, I brought in my daughter to help make the noodles too.
Okay.
And, she was young. She was about 3.5 when I brought her in, because I like to have my kids involved with the kitchen as much as possible. And it was the last Thanksgiving that I really got to make noodles with my mother, because 2 years ago she was diagnosed with a fast-acting dementia. And so last Thanksgiving I wasn't able to make those noodles with my mom, but I was able to make it with my daughter and my sister and my son. Actually, I brought my son in. And so it's this legacy of, while my grandmother's no longer with me and my mom may no longer be with me, I still feel their presence, because this is something that women after women after women have done in my family.
Yes.
And that's what's so wonderful about Thanksgiving is that we come to gather together, family and friends,
Right.
and to have that sensory experience with one another with no expectations of gifts, and we have a blind eye on the dry turkey and a blind eye on the little maybe gross casserole, but we're eating together, and that's what is the most important thing.
And for your family, so if you have a whole spread, is everything else interchangeable but the noodles are not? Or is everything else, this is what it's set to be, but the star of the show, the showcase piece, is this memory piece, which is the noodles?
Everything revolves around the noodles. It's who gets to be first in line to get those noodles. I remember having elbow fights with my cousins to see who could get to the noodles the fastest so that you could get them first on your plate. But the perfect Thanksgiving plate with the noodles being the show is you got a scoop of Grampy Max's mashed potatoes.
Okay, wait, who's?
Grampy Max. He was Granny's husband.
Okay, so you've I'm taking down because we were focusing on the noodles, but you've got some other dishes too.
Yes.
Are they all or?
Well, this was back in my childhood. This was the perfect
Okay, so
plate.
you've got memories associated with pretty much everything on that plate.
Yes.
So you have Grampy Max's
mashed potatoes.
Mashed
He would
potatoes.
always mash it by hand, pouring the milk in with the butter. So you got his mashed potatoes, and you have the turkey, and then the stuffing or the grape or the dressing, whichever one. My mom always made cornbread, and my aunt made the other one. I don't know what it was, but it was a very brown and yellow plate, and then all together, the perfect bite.
And so what I love though is what I hear you saying is people in your family, important people to your legacy, to your generations. They may no longer have a physical seat at the table, but they have a special place on the table, and you continue to speak their names. You continue to talk about who they were and what they've meant to your family, and that Thanksgiving is a time to celebrate. Not only what it means for our country, but then who everybody has been in your family.
Right. And I think that's something that everybody can relate to. And there's this concept that kind of always hangs in the back of my mind when I think about family and generations, and it's, we may die on this earth. That's our first death, but there is this second death that occurs when people stop speaking the name and stop talking about the memory of these people in your life. And with food and with recipes and with memories, those people will continue to live. So I'm talking about great grandmothers that I never even met, but because I'm able to make this recipe that they made, I feel like I've gotten to know them, and I have goosebumps just thinking about it.
That is so interesting.
And
Well,
it's special.
But I love that you say that because I never knew my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, or my paternal grandfather, because they both had passed away before I was born. My mother's father passed away when she was pregnant with my oldest brother. When I married John, he had no idea that I didn't know my grandfather, because my grandmother, we had sat around the kitchen table for forever, and often there was a soap opera from CBS blaring in the background.
Was it Young and the Restless?
Yes, there was. That was the
one my
whole
grandmother.
lineup. and okay, so here you go. For her, it wasn't Noodles; it was Club Crackers and real Coca-Cola. And so it wasn't even like some grand meal, because I think of my grandmother and I think of white bread with margarine squares, that she would put in the oven and burn her arm when she was getting it out of the, all those kinds of things. And so, and I love that because my grandfather, I felt like I knew him because the stories that were shared around that table made him come alive. And so I don't feel like I've gone a day where I did not know him. So I love that you bring that up, because I think as holidays approach, there's so many emotions that come along with it. There's the stress that can just be associated with relationship. There's the stress of a meal, because we feel like a meal has to look a certain way in order to be okay, which from what I'm hearing from you, just say no to that.
Yeah, embrace your legacy, your family legacies, and kind of turn a critical eye, and just you if you want to have that beautiful table with beautiful decorations, but if you're using paper plates, that is okay, because that means cleanup afterwards is going to be a little bit easier.
And I get a big charge out of when I have something like that, of tossing it in the trash.
It's
and like
liberating.
I can spend more time with my family.
Right.
But I think that there is freedom in that, because sometimes I even joke around with the term Thanksgiving worthy, and I know what that means in my mind.
Right.
That's a big setup.
Right.
That's a big, and I think what I hear you saying is Thanksgiving worthy is family
Is
and
relationship.
memories
And it's hosting done with love. Because
Yes.
that's the best get together. That's the best gift you can give to any of your guests, any of your diners. Really, any time of the year is something that is thought out, that's intentional, and whether that's the food, or if that's the table, or if it's just the conversation, it's making those people feel like you took the time to love them in certain capacities outside of just a text, or just takeout. If it's takeout, it's great, but it's the best dinner is done with love.
Well, and so I'm wondering about people who are watching this and really tracking with your story, your beautiful, beautiful story, but maybe they don't have a recipe that has been passed down. Maybe they don't, they love what they're hearing and they so want that for their family, and they want it.
Or they want the heritage,
Yes,
and they
right.
don't have the
but
heritage.
they don't have.
Right,
So
right.
what do you have to say to those people?
Make a choice today and make some. Maybe you have a pancake recipe that you make for your kids every Saturday morning, and pass that on. Like, it doesn't have to be on Thanksgiving. They can just choose a recipe that is near to their heart, and get your family involved in making it. So it's taking a recipe that you already have, or go and look for a recipe that you want to become your tradition in your family, and make a decision and just do it. And just stick to it and be intentional, and ask people, your loved ones, to get involved with it. And that is something that will be passed on to your children and to your friends and to your family, and that's the legacy that you can begin and create. And that's what's just so beautiful about food, is that you can start it. You have 3 times a day to create a legacy. 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, or dinner.
Because it really sounds to me like it's so much more soul food than it necessarily is physical nutrition food.
Yes, like we feed our family and our loved ones physically with the food, but we also feed them spiritually and emotionally, and with relationships. And my family, they weren't great cooks. They didn't want to really spend the time in the kitchen. They wanted to just spend time together around food. And so it didn't really matter what the food tasted like or where it came from, but that we were together, and that was the most important thing, that
Yes.
we were there in the big holidays and the small holidays, and that we were present in each other's lives. And that family, we've kind of spread out. We moved. We don't live in the same city like my grandmother's family did, and
Right.
her family did. We've moved off, but I know that I may be spending Thanksgiving with different extended families
Right.
certain years, but I know that my cousins are making those noodles. And so when I look down at that plate of noodles that I have, I know that they're with me no matter where they're at, or no matter if they've gone on, or if they're back in heaven, but that I'm connected with my family because of those noodles.
That is so beautiful.
It really is, because I think it's really hard when you, and a lot of families have experienced this, and maybe this Thanksgiving may be the first time that there's somebody whose chair is empty. That they've always been there,
Right.
and I think that this is a key to keeping those people, within the celebration, within the and keeping them present, even when their chair is empty that year.
Right.
And I know it's hard that first time, and I'm sure with your grandmother and then with your mother, those first years, and I would think even making the noodles would be a time of experiencing them. And when they weren't there physically,
and it gives me it's a little bit labor intensive. I mean, there's stirring and making the dough and rolling it out and cutting it, and it's a time of reflection for me. And last year when I was making the noodles, my mom couldn't help me, and I got to think about her, but I also thought about my grandmother, and it made me think. My grandmother sat and watched her mother and grandmother make these noodles, but what were they thinking about? Who were they thinking about? Were they thinking about the times of those who had passed on that they made those noodles with? And so it's a time of reflection too, and that I can think on them, and then be thankful for them, that God allowed them to be my mother and to be my grandmother, and that those women were my great-great-grandmothers. So it's a beautiful recipe, and I'm thankful that I have that and that I get to pass that on to my daughter and to my son, because I want my son to also be a part of that legacy, and that he wants to go and make those noodles too, and that's important, I think. And so it is a beautiful gift, and I'm thankful for it. And I know if somebody wants to have noodles as their recipe, I have that recipe on my blog, and they can
we'll share it,
and
for
they can
sure.
make that their legacy, and I will love to share my family with them.
You know, on your About page, you've written some beautiful things, and maybe, you know, how did these, you know, you've got this recipe from your family, but how did that spoke into things that you're doing now? Because food is kind of your life. It's not just these noodles at Thanksgiving, but food is really your life.
Yes. So a little story about me. 10.5 years ago, I had brain surgery. I was newly married.
What?
Yes. I was about 6 months married. We were new to Dallas, and I had a headache for 6 weeks straight, and I didn't have a doctor. So I went to some random doctor, and they just said, this isn't normal, let's get a CT scan. And so I went to Presby Plano and got a CT scan, and they held me over to get another MRI, and then I got the results back. A week later, I was in my kitchen, and I had a new job, and I got a phone call from my doctor, and she said, they found a growth on your pituitary. It's large. It could be benign, or it could be malignant. You're going to have it removed. And she gave me a list of neurosurgeons, and I will never forget that moment. I was all alone. I dropped to my knees, and I just said, Lord, your will, but help me. Like, I have to have help. I can't do this alone. And the next day, one of my best friends, she was randomly in town, and she drove me all around Dallas, picking up records, getting medical information from different doctors. And I got a phone call from a neurosurgeon, and they said, we have an opening in 20 minutes. Can you make it?
What?
And I said, okay. And so I made it.
20 minutes.
Because all these appointments that I was trying to make with these top-notch neurosurgeons were 6 weeks out. 4 weeks out.
And you didn't have that.
And he got me in, and he just said, okay, this is going to have to be removed. This is a simple procedure. And then 2 weeks later, it was out. And I had a little bit of some difficulties recovering. I ended up having just to stay at my house, my apartment, and I couldn't drive. I lost my job because my medical leave was too long, and I needed a hobby. And so I tried scrapbooking, and I'm not a scrapbooker. We all have callings, and scrapbooking was not mine. And I found food, and I found that cooking on that stove or chopping vegetables, I realized some of us are getting really chopped and really sauteed, and but that's part of God's plan for us. So, you know, some of us are served raw, some of us are charred, some are sauteed, some are bruleed. We don't know how our final presentation is, but we all have to be cooked in some capacity. And I thought about this as I was cooking, and I was starting to create recipes at that stage in my life. And food just became really central to my healing process. And me and my husband together our downtime would be in the kitchen in our small apartment, cooking together and being together and creating something together. And 3.5 years ago, I had an eclamptic seizure after I gave birth to my son. And again, I found myself back in the kitchen during my healing process, and just in the back of my mind, this is just one of those other things, part of your recipe. This is part of your recipe of life.
I love it.
And after the 1 year mark, I was tired of being sorry for myself, and I just said, I'm going to start a blog. And I had a lot of friends that just was supporting me and just said, just do it, just start it. And so that's how A Pleasant Little Kitchen occurred, and how I created it. And it was to showcase that, like, the kitchen is more than a hassle and more than just a burden. It is a place of gathering, of loving and creating and healing, and that it can be a joy. And it doesn't have to be this fancy recipe. It can be the most simplest, but it just all goes back to those life stages that I went through, that A Pleasant Little Kitchen developed. And you know, I love it. I love being in the kitchen. I love creating, and I love being able to showcase God's plan for all of us through food, because it's a fun thing to do.
Well, and I love how you talked about that. It doesn't have to be these fancy big recipes, but it also doesn't have to be convenience and just whatever's not hard.
Right.
It sounds like you went on a journey in your own kitchen to all the layers that God wanted to take you through for what He was doing in your life, and that it wasn't centrally about the food, but the food took you to what He wanted you to learn.
Right. And He showed me so much truth while I was pursuing something that I loved, and I was able to find Him in the thing that I loved, and that was food, and He was able to speak those truths to me through food. And I think that's true for anybody if you just allow Him to use your hobby or your job. But you just have to find Him in everything that you do, and He'll show you truth and love and healing.
That is so special. Thank you so much for asking that question. It's really good.
I'm happy. I was glad that I could share it.
Oh, I love it.
And being a mom to two small kids, I have a 6-year-old and a 3.5-year-old, and I realized too that I'm given 3 times a day an opportunity to feed them food. But it's also, I get to feed them spiritually 3 times a day too. And so I try to make that time around my table a time that I feed them spiritually.
Which a lot of it is relationship, just your relationship with them, talking to them. Right. And they do say that relationship that is around food, around a meal, actually is more impactful than any other type of experience together.
Yes, I agree. It's that time of opening up their heart, and that the table is a safe place.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And maybe it is the breaking of bread, the sharing of a meal. And we've watched it. We've had dinner parties for years. And by that, I mean, we started when we were newly married. And we lived in maybe 900 square foot little rental home. And we had a table that we would pile as many people as could fit around it. And nobody cared.
Right, they don't.
That they couldn't move their arms because they were way too close.
They were just happy to be
Oh
there.
my goodness. And I had no dishwasher. I didn't really, all of it was so new to me that there was a house without a dishwasher. And we had this old oven that truly had to have been from the 1920s because it was you would raise it up like that, but it was massive.
Did you have to light it? Because my first
oven... You did not have to light it.
Really? The first house we lived in, I had to pull out the bottom drawer and light it. And
Well, you never know. Yeah. But it's okay, so here you have these impediments. It's no, you can't have them over. No, you can't do this, and all those kinds of things. And the bringing together of people that don't know each other. And I've loved that through the years. And, during different phases, we've definitely had more gatherings. And to say dinner party is a bit of a stretch. It's a gathering. Yes. And it's always so delightful. And I will tell you that when I've dined with somebody, and I've had people over that I don't know, that were friends of somebody, or I felt like somebody had said something, and it's they need a place to land because they don't know anybody. And it's like there's this very genuine thread that has been sewn in our lives together that has a depth to it. And I think a lot of it is because there has been a meal shared together. And so
I agree.
Yeah, and with our kids, it's
a sensory experience where your body is eating to sustain itself, but I think we open up our hearts and our minds to also be fed in relationships, and we're a sensory experience too. We're opening up our hearts to other people too, to be in your life, and eating around the table is just, I think, is beautiful, and it's important. We forget that it's so important.
It is.
We're so fast today, and I want to slow down a little bit and just take that moment, even if it's 15 minutes.
You're right. And you've been special about it. My parents for years would have an open table on Sundays and just invite people They did it. They started it when we were young, and they kept doing it even
That's
when.
So amazing.
Oh, it is. And I remember I was on a semester in Paris, which I had cooked up like some way to finagle it, where I could go do the semester there, and I finagled well. And I remember calling home, and all my friends were at my house eating with my parents, and that's like totally in a different phase because we were grown. I'm not the oldest in my family, and my parents still would she kept and still does keep casseroles, and by that it's just, it could be chicken enchiladas, it could be, it doesn't matter. Right. I mean, it doesn't. She could pick up brisket on the way home, and it's irrelevant because, and they would just invite the people in, and I watched it keep them young. Yeah. I watched it make these young people feel like they were known and they belonged. And it still is something I will bump into a person that's in their 50s and say, I remember having lunch at your parents' house on Sunday.
That's wonderful. That's
and
inspiring.
so,
like, I want to do that.
I remember our first year of marriage. I felt like I needed to kind of catch up on, like, I felt a little convicted about my hospitality and not want. I felt like our house wasn't big enough.
Oh,
I felt like there were so many barriers.
It's hospitality pressures.
Yes, and I felt like that I couldn't, what we had wasn't enough, or it wasn't big enough, or I didn't cook well enough, or, I laugh because I don't know what we ate our first year of marriage. I really don't. But then I decided to put together a calendar that once a month I was going to invite another couple, another young couple. Yeah. I had to have somebody whose standards were about her. Another couple once a month for dinner, and so I made a calendar, and it pushed me more than pushed me way out of my comfort zone. And I think I made pot roast every single time.
And I'm sure you perfected that recipe.
Well, I kept trying, and I will never forget the couple who came over. And pot roast has to cook for a long, long time. Like, I think the recipe called for 6 hours, and I'd always done it for 6 hours. But this particular time, I only had 3 hours. Well, 3 hours is a long time to cook something. And I learned around the table with my friends that it needs to be 6 hours.
That's hilarious.
Would you like a saw? Let me get that knife back from you and take
But they still ate it, I bet.
And the couple, I remember exactly who they were, who came over and ate the pot roast that was so tough. Yeah, that was so tough. They were so gracious and sweet, and now I can look back and laugh and love them even more for their graciousness. I hope that we're all encouraged, and other people who watch this are encouraged to not believe the lies that keep you from having people
family
over.
Like enter into the family, happy day, forget about park your baggage outside, like leave it out there, and maybe that becomes the new tradition. We're not bringing the baggage into this, or whatever it is. If you're having people over, just have them over. They like it. No one cares what you cook.
If you want to become a good cook, and you want to be able to have a dinner gathering where the food is, where that is a central part to it, just try, practice. Make that same pot roast once a month, and then it will be your dinner gathering.
It's your once
recipe.
a month.
It'll be your tradition recipe.
Yes.
And or if you do want the tablescape, there's nothing wrong with including it or rejecting it. Because the heart of it is the people and the relationship and time well spent.
Okay.
Absolutely.
What a great way to end it. The heart of it is the time, relationship, and the time well spent. Okay, thank you so much.
I had such a great time.
I know. I'd say we're never going to forget this. I need food. I needed nuts or something to feed the soul. My soul was fed just by the time.
I'm so